I think I was the first autobiographical women cartoonist. And so I started something that then really developed into a huge art form. But I think a lot of it was timing. It was that 60s period of openness where there was a moment in the culture where there was an explosion and an acceptance for more honesty in work. So I think I slid in there. And then I had, so much angst and alienation from my upbringing that I had a lot to get out and a lot to tell. And I think I was so driven to tell those stories, I didn't stop to think about what would happen or if it would be successful.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey, Joey. There was once a time when Jewish comics creators shied away from telling Jewish stories or depicting overtly Jewish characters. This has changed dramatically in recent years, with women creators taking a prominent role in sharing unabashedly Jewish stories.
We're happy to chat with Victoria Ahrens, the OR and Eva Mitchell Distinguished Professor of Literature at Trinity University and editor of a new book, The Story's Not Over: Jewish Women and Embodied Selfhood in Graphic Narratives. Victoria, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a fan of your show.
You specialize in American Jewish and Holocaust studies. What drew you to comics as a research area?
I never imagined that I would be teaching courses and writing books on Jewish comics. I didn't grow up reading comics or cartoons, and it, the subject really grew out of a class that I teach routinely on Holocaust literature, which I teach every year. What I like to do with the class is to show different forms of representation. So we read Holocaust novels and memoirs and diaries and poetry. And I always included Maus to great success, both volumes of Maus, of Art Spiegelman's Maus. And about 6 years ago now, this little gaggle of students came up to me after the class and said, "We loved Maus. Would you consider teaching a class on Holocaust graphic novels?" And I said, "No, no, I know one Holocaust graphic novel, and this is it." And then I thought, maybe I should do a little research into this and see what else is out there. And so I was amazed. I was just utterly amazed when I started reading the number of graphic novels that return to the Holocaust. Now, in many ways, I shouldn't have been surprised by this because since my area is Holocaust studies, and most specifically Holocaust literature, the direction that my research has gone is in terms of second and now third generation Holocaust writers, the children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who have come of literary age and are just writing remarkable works. Short stories and novels, like I'm thinking offhand of the third generation novelist Julie Oringer, or the Guatemalan Jewish short story writer Eduardo Halfon, and the literature is so rich, and so I shouldn't have been surprised. I just didn't know enough about comics, and so um, I started reading, and then I offered a kind of pilot class, and my students just loved the class. And then the more research I did, I then kind of branched out to Jewish graphic novels in general, not just Holocaust graphic novels. Although so many that are what I found is so many that are being published in the early decades, opening decades of the 21st century, which interestingly has this real boom in Jewish graphic novels and Holocaust graphic novels. But what I found was that so many of these graphic narratives are being written and illustrated by second and third generation graphic artists. And and so that was the first class, but then I offered another class that I now teach also every year on Jewish graphic novels. And one of the interesting things I have found is in so many of, let's say, graphic novels that are not about the Holocaust, there are moments where these writers and artists return to that history, even sort of peripherally and in the backdrop. And so there's enormous overlap. But it's just been so much fun to teach this class. And I know to a certain extent it sounds counterintuitive for me to say it's so much fun to teach the Holocaust, but I have to tell you it is. Um, I get students all the time and friends and colleagues who say, "How can you spend your life reading about, writing about, thinking about, and teaching the Holocaust?" And I I mean, it's some of the best moments outside of obviously being with my family, um, are exactly that, because it's a literature not only of deep trauma and loss, but survival. And the different modes of representation are so fluid and elastic and rich that it's just been a real pleasure.
In the introduction to The Story's Not Over, you write that the comics medium speaks to the visual culture that defines our times. Is this something you noticed as a professor teaching young students?
I teach in an English department. And so it's a literature department. So our majors are readers. Um, However, they're reading less and less. Um, and they are much more attuned to the visual. And I do think the medium speaks to the visual culture in which we live. This kind of engagement with the material world as a means of self definition and identity and placing oneself a kind of sense of belonging. And my students really, really respond to it. And, there's, of course, with the advent of video and digital technology over the past half century or so, um, we find that the visual culture is more and more appealing to the generation of students that we're teaching. And, I teach young adults, and they're all between the ages pretty much of 18 and 22. Um, and and they really respond. In the graphic novel class, all we read are graphic novels, but in the literature of the Holocaust class, I've included, I started, as I said, with Maus, but I also include now, I usually mix it up, but a work by Miriam Caton, We Are on Our Own, the child survivor narrative. And also, very recently, Ari Folman has published a graphic adaptation of the Diary of Anne Frank, which is kind of brilliant. And I have them read parts of Anne Frank's diary and then parts of the adaptation. And I'm always asking the question of what does this do as you're reading it? What is your experience in reading it? And there's another. I'd really recommend this if you're not familiar with it. I think it came out 2 years ago by the Canadian Holocaust scholar Charlotte Scalia, and it's called But I Live. And it's a brilliant hybrid. They're graphic narratives, all by child survivors, and they have been illustrated by graphic artists from across the globe who interviewed these adults who were child survivors. And in the part of the book is that Scalia herself, and the graphic artists have a kind of meta analysis of the process in which they, in a comic strip, draw themselves drawing the comic strip. But Scalia says that the idea for this came when she was, I think her son maybe was 13, um, that when she realized that there needed to be, as she put it, a more engaging way for young people to come to the subject of the Holocaust. And, we're it's amazing now, we're over, what is it, 85 years since Kristallnacht? Almost 80 years since the liberation of the concentration camps. And one thing I do find with my students, even 10 years ago, they knew more history than they do now. And my colleagues who are historians say this as well, and not only about the Holocaust, but I think one of the real anxieties is what is going to happen. Here you've got these young audiences who are increasingly remote from the events of the Holocaust. Um, and 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 we're also at a crucial time historically because we are in an era that will see the end of direct survivor testimony. We're at a time now where even the child survivors are coming to the ends of their lives. And so what now will become of, or how do we now understand testimony and bearing witness? Um, if it's indirect witnessing, if they're the stories of stories told. And I think that the visual medium is a way into that for an audience that's increasingly remote, increasingly distanced. And when you think about what's happened, really, I mean, just again across the globe. Now, my area, of course, is American Jewish specifically, but I mean, the second and third generation writers just, I mean, other than Spiegelman, you've got someone like Bernice Eisenstein who wrote fabulous book. It's a graphic memoir called "I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors," and Michel Kitschka, the Belgian-born Israeli graphic cartoonist who wrote second generation, The Things I Didn't Tell My Father. But then in terms of, and there are more second generation writers, Martin Lemelman, Mendel's daughter, he's an American cartoonist and tells the story of his mother's experience. But then the third generation, other than, Amy Kurzweil, who now has these two wonderful books, but Leila Corman, We All Wish for Deadly Force. I mean, she's the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, and her more recent book, Victory Parade, or Ari Richter's relatively new Never Again Will I Visit Auschwitz. Jeremy Dress, the French third generation, We Won't See Auschwitz. And there's so many new books that are coming out on the Holocaust, but not only on the Holocaust. That graphic artists that are just um, developing new ways of expressing issues related to Jewishness. And what it and I think it's connected to the era in which we live in terms of survivors. Is what does it mean to be Jewish now, especially now? But in the early decades of the 21st century, what does that look like? How do we identify ourselves? What are the possibilities for expression?
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe. When we had the late great underground comics creator and comics historian Trina Robbins on Amusing Jews, she told us that she never dreamed there would be so many women drawing comics in so many styles. What accounts for this phenomenon?
Women graphic artists in general and cartoonists have become increasingly recognized, and Jewish women graphic artists have significantly contributed to the developing cultural production of comics and graphic novels. And there were, of course, groundbreaking women comics artists such as Trina Robbins, um, and also Elena Kaminsky-Crumb, Jonathan, who you wrote about in the book. It's an excellent chapter, who were groundbreaking and who did pave the way for contemporary expression of women cartoonists. Um, but, as Robbins said, as late as the 1970s, there were very few women in mainstream comics in the industry. As she once put it, the underground comics movement well into the 70s was a boys' club. In part, I think this cultural and literary shift is a response to the extensive production of comics narratives since the turn of the 21st century. So women comics artists obviously have been a part of this. But I also think it's a response to the development of feminism. Um, I think it's a response to the extension and evolution of Jewish women's literary expression, really beginning since the end of World War II. But I think it is a response to evolving feminism, the development of feminism, the increased openings and possibilities for women, women becoming more autonomous in creative opportunities, engaging in creative expression and cultural production. Um, we're now hearing more women writers and women's voices. And it's true for women cartoonists across the globe, from different geographies, ethnicities, backgrounds, and cultures. Um, I'm thinking, for example, of a conversation I had with the British Jewish graphic artist Sarah Lightman, who is the author of several volumes, but her own work, The Book of Sarah, which is a graphic memoir. But she refers to art exhibits in Britain, and how there were just not many until recently exhibits that were only for women artists and especially women cartoonists. And so this is certainly not only a sort of a developing feature of cartoonists and women cartoonists, but I think that the wide array of women who have and are producing graphic narratives, what we find is a kind of aesthetics of self-representation by focusing on bodies, on women's bodies, and on giving presence to absence. This kind of this that what the graphic novel allows is for materially reimagining and reanimating the self, giving a voice to interior subjectivity, um, giving a voice to the development of the invention of the self, kind of way of materializing lives and histories. And I, of course, am interested in Jewish women comics artists. Although I've read a lot of others too, but I have to focus somehow. But and their work really demonstrates the richly varied structures and the artistic and literary conceits and stylistic devices, the historical and imagined landscapes that reflect the expansive and elastic possibilities for the genre. And why are there so many different structures and forms and artistic conceits? Because these are artists who are just trying so many different experimental modes of representation. And with the graphic novel, I mean, there's so many different approaches. Someone like the Canadian graphic artist Bernice Eisenstein I was just mentioning, her work is so different from that, say, of the American cartoonist Liana Fink, um, or Anya Ulinich, who draws upon her Russian and Jewish background, or Emil Ferris. My favorite thing is Monsters, second volume that is now out, or the British graphic artist Carol Isaac, who writes about her Iraqi ancestors in the graphic memoir The Wolf of Baghdad, which is a silent memoir. They're illustrations, but you don't have people talking. And so she tries out what does silence mean? I'm really interested in this now because not a lot of writers are using silence in this way. What happens in the ellipses, in the spaces? How does silence evoke trauma? How does silence evoke memory? Um, And so they're all doing such different things. And one of the fun aspects of this recent volume, The Story's Not Over, is that all the chapters are so different. Even a couple of the chapters that deal with the same graphic artists do so in entirely different ways because the artistic variety um, is so different and so rich. And one of the one of the aspects of graphic novels, and I prefer the term graphic narrative to graphic novel because of course, even though graphic novel is the generic term, um, because so many of these works are not novels, if by novels we mean works of fiction. Um, they're memoirs, they're they're biographies and autobiographies because what we find in many, I mean, one of the recurring structures of and thematic patterns in Holocaust graphic narratives and in Holocaust literature in general, for second and third generation writers, is to turn the telling over to the authenticity, the voice of the legitimacy of the direct witness. And all of these that I'm referring to, Mouse, where Spiegelman draws himself taking notes on his father's story. He turns the story over to his father. In fact, there's that one image where he turns the drawing over to his father. When his father takes the pencil and says, "Let me draw for you this bunker just in case." It's this kind of cautionary warning. But in Bernice Eisenstein's I Was a Child of Holocaust Survivors, even though she draws on that cover of the book, she draws herself as a young child, a cartoon version of herself, casting shadow behind her. It's not her shadow she casts behind her. It's the shadows of her parents, whose lives, whose experiences in the Shoah um, define her life and cast a shadow over her life. But in the course of that book, she turns the telling over to her her mother, to her father. She gives them their narratives in their voice. Amy Kurzweil does that in Flying Couch, which is her own coming of age narrative, but it's also the story of her grandmother's escape from the Warsaw Ghetto and her survival. And those two stories intermix, but she turns the telling over to her grandmother. She gives her that voice. And one thing that we find with graphic novels, one thing that's so exciting and rich about the genre is that you can be in two spaces visually at once. You enter the space, the panel, often framed, but not always, but it's like entering a portal, and you can move fluidly from different temporalities and different spatial moments. You can be, in other words, in two spaces at the same time, which is, of course, what we mean by, in large part, by memory, right? Because one of the struggles, the challenges for me in talking about the first book, well, the Holocaust graphic narratives, but also then memory spaces, and then this one of my interests is how do you draw memory on the page? What does memory look like on the page? What does trauma look like on the page? And with the graphic narrative, you can have two adjacent, say, panels that overlapping panels when you are in two conceptual spaces at once. You're in the past, but you're also in the present. And that's what happens when we remember something, right? We are in the present, in the contemporary moment where we are, but we are also in the past moment of remembering. And that I'm thinking of again, Amy Kurzweil, and there's just a stunning moment in Flying Couch, where the third generation, the granddaughter, the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, is walking down the road, down a path with her mother and grandmother. And she turns to her grandmother and looks into her grandmother's reflective glasses. She does not see herself. She sees an image of the child who would have become her great aunt had she not died of starvation in the Warsaw Ghetto. So this child who died 50 years ago is brought back to life at this moment on the page where absence is given presence, invisibility is given visibility. But you have two moments there, where the grandchild who lives in the present, in the contemporary life, sees not herself. In many ways, her own visage is eclipsed for that of the great aunt she never knew. And graphic narratives, comics narratives, allow you to do that because of the panels and the frames and the spaces, the gutters in between panels and in between frames are these moments of contemplation, to be sure, but they're also moments in which you can move around in memory, and you can move around in temporality and in space.
The Story's Not Over collects essays examining diverse contributions of Jewish women, graphic novelists, and memoirists. You describe these artistic works as embodied memory. Could you explain?
Memory in a variety of forms and artistic articulations is visualized, given bodily form on the page. Whether it's a figure from the past, like I was just mentioning with Amy Kurzweil, or a conceit, for instance, that's not atypical. I'm thinking, for instance, of an image that bleeds off the page. It can bleed into the future, but it can also bleed into the past. And so memory exists as it is drawn, as it's given corp- corporeal corporeal shape and texture and body. Um, there's this moment in Martin Lemmelman's really terrific Mendel's Daughter, where he draws on this one panel, and it's framed, an image of his mother's family as they existed before the rupture, before the occupation, before they were taken to concentration camps. What he does with this image is, on one side, it's the family sitting, it's an ordinary domestic scene. They're sitting around a breakfast table. On one side, bleeds off into the past, and you can't see it, but you can imagine the other rooms, their lives before the onslaught. And then what he does on the right-hand side, facing side, is he starts erasing the figures that he has just drawn. And what we as viewers can see are these erasure marks as they are being made, these jagged marks, and they too bleed off the page. And so there are all these different layers of memory here. There's a memory that this artist didn't have because it's not his memory. It's his mother's memory that has been transmitted to him through storytelling. And yet, he is transmitting her memory through his visual articulation, that is, drawing the memory on the page so that we enter the text of that past. And so you've got memory kind of consciously embodied, lost and found, the invisible made visible, the dead child in the glasses, or one's different selves. I mean, I'm thinking of so many of these Jewish women graphic artists who are focused on issues of identity and interiority and reinvention, self-reinvention, which one could well argue is a kind of Jewish conceit in general, right? I mean, when you think about the long history of Judaism and the long exilic and diasporic history. It's a history of reinvention, of remaking the self in other places and other venues, in other histories, in other cultures, in other languages. And we really see it here in the graphic narrative, and this too in memory of other selves. And so you've got these writers. I'm thinking of Anya Ulinich's really terrific graphic narrative, Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel, which is, of course, a riff on the very famous short story by Bernard Malamud, The Magic Barrel. And she kind of rewrites where the Magic Barrel, which is about Leo Finkel, who's a rabbinical student who can't find a wife, and he goes to the marriage broker, and he doesn't like any of the marriage broker's choices. But what what Anya Ulinich does brilliantly is to make the Shadchen, the marriage broker, OkCupid, an online dating site, and her main characters, not Leo Finkel, but Lena Finkel. And but what she does is to draw her various avatars, her various selves, throughout her sort of coming of age. And at one point, she draws her miniature self, her little super ego who sits on her shoulder or is in her backpack, or she finds her in her cup of coffee. But so there are all these different selves. And what is the self you remember the best? Are you the same self you were at 17? I mean, in some ways, it's a self I barely recognize. It's also a self I recognize all too well. And so, with visualizing, not only memories of histories, but certainly that's a part of it. Different histories, different historical landscapes, but also memories of different selves and sort of reinvention of selves and transformations of selves. In Liana Fink's Passing for Human, you have this semi-autobiographical avatar who has lost her shadow. Well, what she's really lost is her identity. And it's all about lost and found. At one point, she writes, I hope I'm not going to misquote her, but a drawer draws because she has lost something, and in drawing, she will find it again. Because you materialize it, because we enter these spaces of memory, they're performed. It's a kind of performance of the self and a performance of memory. And of course, memory and identity are always linked. Um, and as is history and history. On the one hand, history with a capital H. In most of my work, the history of the Holocaust, the enormity of that historical event. But within that, you have history with a little h, individual histories, individual stories. And we find this, of course, not only obviously with the Holocaust, but with other moments of historical movement. I'm thinking, for instance, of Lila Korman's Untersachen, which it's a Yiddish word which means ladies under things. It addresses, in large part, the backdrop is the history of turn of the 20th century immigration and the development of Jewish communities in the Lower East Side, and the rise of the garment industry that was, of course, run primarily by seamstresses who were women and Jewish women. And so you've got that history of immigration, but it's told through these individual histories, individual memories, or another example is Liana Fink's A Bintel Brief, which is also about immigration, the years surrounding the turn of the 20th century in the Lower East Side, and the beginning of the Forward, the newspaper magazine for primarily a Yiddish-speaking audience. socialist audience as well. But a Bintel brief was a bundle of letters, and it was the advice column. And we have these letters. And what Fink does is to take, I think there are 11 of them, or maybe 7 of them, I don't know, these letters from the archives, and she brings them to life again in a Bintel brief, Love and Longing in Old New York. And but what happens there is there's this larger scope of history and the memory of this history of this sort of unbelievable moment for Jews and Jewish immigrants into the United States. But it's told through these individual histories, individual stories of people who've who are so displaced and so confused. And so they're the larger memories, historical memories, and also individual memories.
What are some of the themes you found recurring in the works examined in the book?
So many of these works go back to histories, not only the Holocaust, but certainly the Holocaust. There's a fascinating chapter. I learned so much about it, about women's graphic albums that were drawn with whatever materials were available in concentration camps. Um, but also they're very contemporary chapters in here about that can deal with contemporary historical moments as well, and the times in which we live. So history, certainly. Identity. I mean, I would say that, although I know this is quite a generalization, I think all of these works, to one extent or another, get at issues of identity and how we identify ourselves. And in the case of course, the Jewish women graphic artists that we're talking about in the collection, as Jews, as women, and as artists. And where are the intersections? Where are the complexities? Um, I think that comes up in pretty much all of these. Memory, of course, loss of self, loss of other, loss of a kind of stabilizing frame for the expression of identity, loss of place. And these are all sort of sites of memory, sites of identity. So many of these writers ironize um, the reconstruction of the fantasy of a coherent identity. You know, identity is shown in all of these works to be anything but coherent, to be slippery, to be elastic, to be mutating, to be mercurial, um, something to chase after, something to redefine. And I think that's some and remembering is a common theme in all of these as well.
As you're saying that, I'm remembering just the subject of my own chapter in the book, Aileen Kaminsky-Crumb, who very famously never drew herself the same way twice, would often draw herself differently within the same story. So this idea of like a shifting, impermanent, ever-changing identity is really crucial in her storytelling.
So many of these graphic artists do that. There's this one two-page spread in Sarah Lightman's The Book of Sarah, in which it's almost like an art gallery, but there's one framed panel after another. In every one, she draws a self-portrait. Everyone looks different, as if she's trying to kind of try on the right fit.
I'm wondering if it took women creators to really draw that out. Obviously, it's not gender specific, the idea of trying to find one's identity, but it seems so, as you say, dominant in this kind of storytelling and so natural and authentic. I don't know if it has something to do with women finally having the chance to explore these themes.
And to voice their interior selves, to give voice, to give voice to women's bodies. And I mean that both sort of physically, visually in the graphic novel, but also in terms of the developing self. In a, it wasn't that long ago. My students like to say that, oh, feminism is dead, and okay, you did that for us, but we're well beyond that now. I don't think so. I think these are still issues that women are grappling with, but their voices are being heard increasingly. And the comics genre is a really good example of this because it was so male defined for so long. I mean, and when you think about the history of Jewish comics, I mean, well before, I cited Eisner with coining the term, but look at the original Superman story. I mean, was written by Jerry Siegel, who was the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants who arrived in New York right around the turn of the 20th century, and illustrated by Joe Shuster, also the child of immigrant Jews. And, Superman's first appearance, I don't know when, maybe late 30s, 38 or something, but that whole group of writers beginning, those artists, those cartoonists beginning then were men, were Jewish men. And it didn't really open up until much later
What makes comics such an effective medium for preserving memory?
because you can visualize memory spaces. You can make memory manifest on the page. You can look at memory. What does memory look like? In or what is it? What are the limitations of memory? A lot of these writers try to get at this as well. I'm thinking here of, just for example, Miriam Caton in We're on Our Own, the story of her mother's and her survival in Budapest after the German occupation. She, Miriam Caton, was what we refer to as the 1.5 generation. She was there when the events happened. They happened to her. She was subjected to them. But she was 2 years old at the time that they went into hiding in the Hungarian countryside. And she does and does not remember, and yet she was there. And this is very different in so many ways from, say, Spiegelman's not remembering because he wasn't there, or Lemmelman's not remembering, or Kurzweil's not remembering. How can you remember something you didn't experience? And of course, in this way, memory functions metaphorically, and I think very usefully. So what Caton does, she remembers may not be the right word for it, but she remembers sensations, feeling cold, feeling hungry. She remembers a dog. Um, she remembers her mother's fear. But when she doesn't remember the specific event, she doesn't know the kind of peril that she was in, but it was a felt, haptic peril. And that's something that can be done visually. That because the graphic narrative is a very haptic medium, it's a felt medium. And so she'll draw memory in many ways when it's being hazy, where she can't quite touch it, but it's something just beyond her reach. And so there are these very softly drawn sketches. They're blurred. Um, and they are so to indicate that she does not quite remember them, but they are there, just beyond her reach. And of course, also with a graphic narrative, the commingling of text and image. So you've got a kind of forum for a montage of voices, a panoply of different voices, where you've got the voice of, let's say, the character who's telling her story, but you also have the voice of the artist who may not have any lines in there at all, but whose drawings are interpretive. They interpret those memories, what those memories look like. Did they really look that way um, to the person who was there? Maybe not, but that's how they look now. So you've got, again, these different temporalities. And one thing that also you find in these works is a blending and blurring, of course, of genres. I mean, the very hybridity of text and image, but not only that. And this is a characteristic I have argued of certainly Holocaust literature, but also of Jewish literature, where, is this a memoir? Is this a novel? Is this a short story? Yes. I mean, is Maus the a, a biography of Vladek Spiegelman's experiences in Auschwitz? Yes, but it's also autobiographical. It's what it means to be the son of Holocaust survivors. So you've got this blending and blurring of traditional genres, which I think gives it a real richness.
Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.